welcome back to the Sussex Ontario Election Show. I'm Joe Ragusa. I'm a partner here and the head of the Ontario Government Relations Group. It's the day after the Ontario election. It's finally concluded, and we want to welcome everybody to Ford Nation. Pleased to be joined today by Brett James, partner here at Sussex. Brett, thanks for coming in.
It's a particularly sunny day in Ontario, so I thought I'd wear my sunglasses just to reflect that. Actually, I've got a bit of an eye sensitivity issue, so forgive that you maybe can't see my eyes, but I'm happy to be here, and as a long-time progressive conservative staffer, supporter, volunteer, I certainly feel that this is a long overdue change, and it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out for what I think will be the betterment of Ontario.
All right, well, let's talk about it. So for those of you who may not know, Brett was an early PC government staff person. The last time that there was a change in government in favor of the PC party was under Premier Mike Harris back in 1995. And back then, we had a PC government that came in on the heels of the NDP government that preceded them. And so maybe just for our viewers, talk a little bit about what these people are walking into. There's going to be a new cabinet sworn in probably in about 3 weeks. They'll be staffed up. There's a transition team in place now. What sorts of things are they going to be looking for? What will they be doing their first days on the job?
First days will be about, I think, establishing a tone for this government and laying out some of their priorities. Obviously, they had 5 fairly simple but large priorities that they campaigned on. Those will be the center of that, and the transition team has a number of jobs. It has to look after how the new government presents itself even before there is a cabinet. They have to start the work of helping to pick who's going to be in cabinet, because I think Mr. Ford will be looking for some advice in that regard. And of course, his close staff, his campaign staff, and the transition team will be working very hard on that. And then they'll have to, as they pick a cabinet, work on things like what's become the sort of de rigueur or the norm these days with governments is typically their mandate letters that get developed and provided to new cabinet ministers and to their staff, which are the instructions of what the Premier and the Premier's office expects to be carried out. Then there's also the work of starting to establish a relationship and an approach and work with the civil service, who have been busy these last couple of months knowing that there would be some type of transition, maybe to the former government had they won the election, but regardless there was going to be change. So they've been tasked with preparing for that change, being ready to brief new ministers, their staff, being ready to present some policy options that will reflect what the priorities were of Mr. Ford and the PC party during the election, and how those policy options might fit with those priorities.
Right, and I would add it seems to be something that maybe we've imported from south of the border, but there's an increased importance attached to the first 100 days. Mm-hmm. So the government will want to be seen as hitting the ground running, revisiting some of the themes that Doug Ford articulated during the campaign, making life more affordable, cleaning up the hydro mess, etc. I think he'll want to be seen to be taking early action on that. You referenced a cabinet, so the speculation has already begun. I'll kick it off by saying, since not only because she finished second in their leadership, but I think in the last 7 or 8 days, I think Christine Elliott was at every event that Doug Ford was at, regardless of where it took place in the province. Safe to say that we can expect Christine in the cabinet?
I think that's very safe to say. I'd be shocked to see anything otherwise, and I would advise against it if anybody suggested they should. There are a lot of factors go into cabinet making. If we take a step back for a second, you do look at those leadership rivals and their various, both the capabilities, experience, but also the constituency that they represent, which in cases of leadership rivals, there's significant factions within the party that are very loyal to those people, and you want to make sure that loyalty is rewarded, that everybody feels like they're part of the movement and inside that big tent, so to speak. And then you have to look beyond that at people's various experiences, their life experiences and capabilities, their geography, because I'm sure there'll be a geographic representation across the country, since the PC's won seats in basically every part of the province. So they'll start to take all of those factors into consideration, and certainly we can talk about people, but it's going to be, I think, a healthy mix of some of the leadership rivals, some of the other bright lights that he had around the table when he showcased the team about 2 weeks ago. I think there was a bit of a turning point in the approach in the campaign.
Vic Fideli, Lisa MacLeod, Caroline Mulroney,
Peter Bethenfalvey, some of the new candidates, as well as some of the existing caucus, and obviously the people that were around that table will have some expectation that they were showcased for a reason and they've got a good shot at being in cabinet. I doubt promises have been made at that point in time, but if I was around that table, I'd be thinking, okay, good, I have a really good chance at this.
I'm being showcased for a reason.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, you touched on it. I looked at the results from yesterday, and the PCs have elected northern members, rural members, urban members, suburban members. They've elected some pretty strong women. They've elected people from culturally diverse communities. They really do have a lot of options to choose from. I don't know that there's any particular group or segment of the population that is not reflected there. Of course, Ontario has a very, very multicultural population, so it's not to say that every country in the world is represented in the PC caucus, but certainly there is a lot of diversity there, and in looking at it, there's really no part of the province shut out, unlike, say, in 2014, where the Liberal caucus was pretty urban. It was pretty Toronto, it was pretty Ottawa, it was not particularly rural at all. So in making his cabinet, I guess the other thing I would add is that when Doug Ford sought out and won the leadership of the PC party, he initially had the support of one PC MPP, that was Raymond Cho from Scarborough, and then when Patrick Brown fell out the second time, Toby Barrett from Haldimand, Norfolk went to Doug Ford, and that's it. There's not a long list of MPPs who will go to him now, who can go to him now and say, hey, I helped put you over the top in the leadership. My expectation is that you put me in cabinet now.
Yeah, it's a factor, and I'll come back to that in just a second. I think that, you know, what you're referring to in terms of diversity, both gender and ethnic diversity, he has options that other parties maybe haven't had in the past, because, as you said, winning seats in every part of the province and being quite a diverse group of candidates that did win. I also think that there's not a lot of expectation out there in terms of, you know, if we compare it to, say, Prime Minister Trudeau winning in 2015, there was already a lot of talk and emphasis on gender diversity and diversity of that cabinet, to the point that traditional representation in cabinet from the Italian-Canadian community, for instance, suddenly there was none in that federal cabinet. I don't think that there's the same kind of expectations on Mr. Ford, but he has the luxury of being able to achieve a lot of those same goals without it being maybe some sort of an explicit quota or an explicit a goal that he has stated he has to achieve. So it's a great spot to be in. Then coming back to your point, I'm sorry, and I've lost my train of thought, Joe.
That's okay. Well, we were talking about the regional representation, the cultural diversity,
yes,
and that he didn't have a lot of caucus backing when he won the leadership.
Thank you.
So there's no one that is expecting that they're owed something as a result of that.
It was a concern of mine going into the election, as somebody who cares about the health of the party and believes that a progressive conservative party has an opportunity to deliver some very great things for Ontario. I worried that if the win wasn't strong enough, that there could still be some of that infighting that we've seen in the last 4 months within the party, which is very unhealthy, and I believe it's in everybody's best interest to put all of that stuff away. I think that a 76-seat majority is telling, and it puts Mr. Ford in a very strong position to make the case that that he maximized the opportunity that was presented to him, because a minority or a slim majority, there would be some saying we could have done better if we'd had somebody else. I don't think that case can be made anymore. There are seats that were won because of the strength of Ford Nation. There are seats maybe in downtown Toronto that might have had an opportunity. The one that I happen to live in is Toronto St. Paul's, and it's been a Liberal stranglehold for many, many years. It went NDP last night, and I believe, having worked as a volunteer for my local candidate, that people had already made up their mind they weren't going to vote Liberal, and it's traditional Liberal riding. But this is, your quote-unquote downtown elites, and they were not prepared to vote for Mr. Ford, so it went to the NDP in a riding that's never gone NDP before. So my point being that maybe another leader could make you could make the argument another leader might have had a chance to win that seat, but there are many other seats that carried because of Mr. Ford, and I think that the strength in the Mississaugas, Etobicoke, Scarboroughs, of course, are direct ones, and he's certainly played well in traditional PC ground in rural Ontario and some of the other regional cities.
I think, importantly, Ford gave the rural conservative voter who's been unhappy with the events at Queen's Park and who's running Queen's Park for the last number of years, a comfortable place. And when you take that and you add what he brings to the equation, and look, we had him on this show back when he was still in the leadership contest, and I remember looking at the mayoralty results from 2014 when he finished second to John Tory, and it was clear that they were at Etobicoke and Scarborough and parts of North York where Doug Ford has a certain amount of appeal. Granted, maybe in University Rosedale, in Trinity Spadina, or Spadina Fort York, St. Paul's, maybe not the same appeal. However, no leader wins every riding ever, except for Frank McKenna that one time in New Brunswick. But other than that, I think that the appeal was good. The message was simple. I'm doing a write-up for our clients, whereas the NDP's gambit, if you will, if you look at the NDP platform and you look at the Liberal budget of 2018, they're very similar. Certain eligibility criteria change, but pharmacare is there, child care is there, mental health is there, hospital funding is there. Where they differ is, look, I'll pay for these drugs, I'll pay for these drugs, I'll pay for people under 25, I'll pay for everybody. So their gambit seemed to me to be, if you like all of this stuff, but you're sick of them, you can vote for us and you'll still get the stuff, but get rid of them. And there was a while there, I think halfway during the campaign, where the NDP really caught fire. But the PCs got a little over 40% of the vote last night. So I'm wondering if that's a reflection that the public at election time is not necessarily looking for the nitty-gritty details of policy, but maybe bought into the tone. When Doug Ford says, I'll stop wasting money. The party with the taxpayers' money is over. Although some of our healthcare clients are wondering if their invitation to that party maybe got lost in the mail because things have been pretty tight in that space lately. Do you think it's a case that Ford and his people just figured out we don't need to get into all of the 87-page costed, itemized platform? If we tell people how we will go about it with some detail, 10 cents a liter off of gasoline.
Yep.
That's pretty specific. But it's easy to understand. I don't need to read a backgrounder on it. It's just, okay, that's what he'll do, as opposed to the other parties, which maybe got a little too in the weeds in terms of policies and how they would govern. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you're right. And I think what we saw, where they had leeway to take that approach, in my view, is there was enough out there already that suggested, certainly from the provincial auditor, that the numbers as presented by the government were not necessarily what's actually going on with the fiscal situation in Ontario. Meaning, many said that they said that there was a $6 billion hole in the government's plan. And we had early on in the election, the NDP put out their platform, and there was a $1.5 billion problem in their math. So it was really, I feel, only the media that were looking for that fully costed platform as a way to try to pin down Mr. Ford. They seem to dwell on it a fair bit, and I think that the electorate was not there because I think they bought the idea that every party, when they take over government, has to go in and see what's really going on with the books. And to be too specific is probably foolish. So if you lay out what your priorities are, and as you said, give a sense of how you intend to get there, I think that that's enough for people, regardless of political stripe. I don't think it has to be down to the penny, because you'd be basing that on probably a false set of assumptions.
And it was a change election. And I think Andrea Horwath, smartly at the outset, framed this election as a binary choice. She said Kathleen Wynne's not going to be premier after June 7th. It'll either be Doug Ford or it'll be me. She was right, I would say, but she didn't give the so-called progressive voters who coalesced around Kathleen Wynne in 2014 to stop the Hudak PCs enough of a comfortable home for them to all come there. Certainly enough of the I want change voters went to the progressive conservatives. So it didn't necessarily break down along those lines. I wanted to ask you, because you're someone that knows a lot about communications, I thought that the PC ads in the last 7 to 10 days, where they essentially carpet bombed the NDP for some of the unfortunate statements that some of their candidates had made over time, certainly a strong message about the NDP will destroy the economy. I thought those were effective, and I think that may have moved the needle in their favor. Do you agree?
I think so. I think it was a really smart move at the time, and put it in context. We had an evolving campaign where Ford Nation was the brand that was used for just about everything, certainly in the early days, and it has a certain amount of appeal in certain places, as we talked about, and with a certain constituency that were diehard and going to vote PC because of Doug Ford. But what became clear when you have a very short, he was leader for a very short time. I think he said last night he had 88 days from being elected leader to last night. He had a very short time to make an impression on the rest of the province that doesn't necessarily know who he is. And the major medium from a mass media point of view was really through the debates and whatever coverage there is via media. And then I'll come back to what he did directly to the people. But in that debate format, it's not his strength, and I think he would say the same if he was sitting here. Likely, he's a very good communicator in certain ways, but when you want to when you get questions that are getting down into the weeds on policy, nobody was going to beat Kathleen Wynne on those types of things. Andrea Horwath did her best to say, I can be a very reasonable alternative, but it wasn't Mr. Ford's strengths. So as the campaign progressed and we had a couple of those debates, I think that when people were only seeing him in that setting, it wasn't necessarily creating the kind of confidence he needed to have in him as a leader that was going to win the day. So they made a shift. Maybe it was always a planned shift. I'm not in the war room, but I have lots of friends that were. And they started to showcase the team and return a little bit more to that broader brand. And there was such a strong cast of people that are now elected and good choices for cabinet, that it was a great juxtaposition they viewed relative to Andrea Horwath and her team. So they switched the attention onto that juxtaposition of people, and I think it made a significant difference in the campaign.
Well, I think if asked, they would say that's why they highlighted the candidates. I have to say I was following the election extremely closely and looking at every poll that was published by anybody, and there was also a period in time when Ford's own personal numbers started to slide a little bit. So that fortuitously coincided with all the stuff coming out about the NDP candidates and who said what about poppies and the price of gasoline that the Tories use. Well, the fact that Ford surrounded himself with those candidates, I think, helped him in both ways. It did the contrast to the NDP team, but it also, I think, and this is the point in time where there was a little less talk about Ford Nation and a little more talk about the party and the team and the candidates.
Yep.
And I agree. I mean, they certainly fielded a really strong team of candidates. Good combination, as you said, of people that were already in the caucus, new people that they recruited, people with a good mix of private sector experience, previous government experience. I think we have a couple that were actually in the federal government not too long ago. People that have a wide array of backgrounds, and I think will add to the conversation really well. Would you have taken the decision or advised the decision to really limit media availability? I mean, all of the journalists that were on the trail or going to events complained and bemoaned about the fact that they were only allowed a certain number of questions before they were cut off. It's a risky strategy because the media can really hammer you for doing that, as opposed to Andrea Horvath, that I think her busiest day, she had 8 events and took media questions after each of them. High risk strategy, but apparently it had a reward.
Yeah, and I think a less and less risky strategy as time goes on. I mean, I'm one that believes that mainstream media influence is certainly, it's on the decline.
Yeah.
You know, they can protest it. We see it reflected in many different ways, whether it's readership and viewership, which is certainly way down. We saw the influence of third parties and the parties themselves online, and most of those, you can take the example of Ontario Proud to give them a plug. They had greater influence than any of the parties themselves online.
This is when you apply the metrics, how many eyes have looked at
that's
their
right,
material.
And kind of time they spend on it, etc. And so Mr. Ford going directly to people with his own advertising, which is targeted, his own direct message, unfiltered by media. I think it's the norm as opposed to an exception now. I did an interview with the National Post early on in the campaign, and some subsequent media around this, and you know, it's certainly not the first to do it. It's not a left or a right thing. It's an example of packaging your message and delivering it in a way that technology allows today that didn't 10 and 15 years ago, and being able to take it directly to people. So, you know, whether if it's limiting that access, media were welcome at all of his events. There wasn't a bus, and he didn't take as many questions as the others. But at the end of the day, I don't think the voters care. That's the inside baseball kind of stuff that might drive media crazy, which I find a little bit funny too, because, you know, Mr. Ford, I think he enjoys a microphone, and I think he enjoys talking to the media, and I don't think it's a personal choice. It's a, where am I going to be most effective getting my message out? It's actually directly to the people he wants to talk to.
Yeah, and I would suggest that the results from yesterday would say that he was right, that his campaign team certainly benefited from the decisions that they made. I thought that the PC campaign overall was really well done, well run. I know there's a lot of Liberals that even before yesterday were asking their own party, what are we doing? Not a textbook campaign. Future doesn't look good for them. They're going to have a lot of debt now. They have 7 seats. They don't have official party status. Kathleen Wynne resigned as leader last night. They're going to have to go through a leadership process without a lot of tools and without a lot of the funding that they need.
It's a tough spot to be in. I think somebody put it well in my Twitter feed this morning. I think they escaped death a couple of times, and when you're that lucky, and what I mean is I think the PCs have blown a couple of chances in the past couple of elections. You're that lucky, eventually it's going to catch up to you, and it caught up in a big way. So, yeah, it's, well, listen, and not quite to that extent, but the PCs have been there before with a significant debt and not a big caucus. They certainly had official party status. One media member was commenting this morning that yes, there might be a choice where the PCs and NDP could choose to lower that threshold to give them official party status, but it's been done a couple of times before. And when do you stop doing that? If you keep doing it all the time, it eventually becomes irrelevant. So it'll be an interesting balance between, do we do that because it's a magnanimous kind of thing to do to help the Liberals, or do we stick with, some point in time you've got to stop lowering that bar? It'll be an interesting line to walk.
I think the McGuinty, under the McGuinty government, the Liberals and the Conservatives agreed to lower it from 10 to 8 to accommodate the Howard Hampton-led NDP, but that was also at a time when the number of seats was reduced. You recall there used to be 130 seats and Mike Harris adopted the federal boundary, so there were fewer seats, therefore you could make the case that that threshold be lowered. Here we've gone from 107 seats to 124, right. So are we going to lower the threshold from 8 to something less than 8? Although one could, if you were a little more cynical, say that the PCs would actually benefit from having a viable Liberal Party to keep that split, if you will, between the NDP and the Liberals. Only they know what they're going to do, but certainly a tough spot. So looking forward, we've got about 2 minutes left. I think we're going to give everybody a chance to settle in. We'll see how it goes. Personally, I don't subscribe to the belief that Doug Ford and his government will be on some kind of right-wing agenda. I think that there's a certain amount of pragmatism, not only with him, but some of the people around him. I think that they're interested in solving problems and doing what's right and not being so bound by rigid ideology. You concur?
I think you've summed it up nicely. I mean, Ontario is a center, even center-right province generally, small c, conservative, and I think that's exactly where they sit. I think if you put some of the inner party battles aside, I think that Doug Ford he's not an ideologue. I think that he's built a team around him that has a good sense of what balance to strike with Ontarians, and I think you're going to see a fairly pragmatic approach. The team that was built under the former leader was very much that way, and I think that they haven't done anything to veer significantly from that at all. In fact, a lot of that platform that was developed was very much centrist from a PC perspective, and they've taken many of those major tenets and continued to run with them. So I think you'll, those that are worried that the sky was going to fall today, I think that it certainly won't. Even those on the PC side that were worried about what it might mean, I think you're going to see a very reasoned approach to everything. With and of course the big caveat is they've got to get in and take a look at the province's books. And does that mean that there's going to have to be reductions? I imagine it's more a case of finding where we don't need to have the same kind of significant growth we've had recently in certain areas, rather than cuts. I don't see that. So I think that people can look forward to an opportunity where there's going to be, I think, a very reasonable approach from a fiscal perspective and some surprising moves, I think, in some of those social elements. You've seen what those priorities are in healthcare, for instance. I think there'll be a great deal of focus, and people should know that on that transition team today, the person that put together those key tenets for Mr. Ford in the platform, Dr. Ruben Devlin, a long time, very centrist PC activist and former party president, but a hospital CEO, is advising on transition too. And I think that, so if you take healthcare as an example, a very reasoned approach is what we can expect.
All right. That's all the time we have. Listen, it's been a pleasure for us to do this for you every Friday. We've enjoyed it. This will be our last election show now that the election is concluded. Brett, thanks for taking the time today. We hope you've enjoyed it. We look forward to your feedback. We want to hear from you. As always, if you have any questions at all about any of these topics or what lays ahead with the new government at Queen's Park, please feel free to get in touch with one of us, as always. That concludes this series. Thank you, and we will be in touch with you again on other subjects soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.